Hi everybody, tonight we begin a quiet and immersive journey through the shadowed steppes and windswept highlands of a world long gone. This is the story of life in the Mongol Empire, of survival, silence, and storm. Not as the Khans and generals lived it, but as you might, waking beneath a canopy of firs in a land where the sky never ends and the rules are carved not in ink but in blood and cold wind. You will discover piece by piece why you might not last a single day in this empire, and yet why its memory still stirs something deep and ancient in the soul. Settle in, breathe deep, and let the quiet draw you closer. The air that morning was thinner than you expected. It sliced against the inside of your nostrils like it had claws, and though the sun crept up over the horizon with a golden hue, the warmth it promised never touched your skin. It was the kind of cold that lived beneath the flesh, the kind that didn't merely bite at your fingers or toes, but made a quiet home in the space between your ribs. You woke inside a jur, a circular tent of felt and hide, stretched across a wooden frame that groaned softly in the wind. The floor beneath you was not solid ground, but layered rugs in the firm bend of frozen earth. Around you, the scent of boiled mutton, stale milk, and smoke soaked into everything. The fabric of the tent, the furs wrapped around your body, and even your breath. Your throat itched with it. You weren't alone. The family who allowed you to stay had already risen. The father had gone out with the herd before first light. The mother stirred ashes into a weak flame in the hearth at the center of the tent, its smoke escaping through the circular opening above. Two children sat close to each other, half asleep, wrapped in sheepskins with dirt smudged on their cheeks and snow crusted on their hair. They didn't speak. They just stared at you. You tried to offer a tired smile, but it fell away. The moment did not call for warmth, it called for awareness. Outside, the sound of hooves, not gentle clopping like in a field, but the sharp, precise rhythm of purpose. A group of men rode past, boughs slung across their backs and leather armor creaking as they moved. Their eyes, dark slanted, unreadable, swept across the camp, and for a moment you could feel yourself becoming small. Not invisible, just less significant than the wind. No one explained anything to you. That was something you learned quickly. Language mattered, but not as much as silence. Here on the steppe, words were spent like gold. If you couldn't feel what someone meant, you likely wouldn't live long enough to understand it. You stepped outside, the cold biting harder now that the warmth of the fire no longer held you. The land stretched forever in every direction. No fences, no trees, just hills rising and falling like the backs of sleeping giants. Your breath coiled in front of you like a ghost, vanishing quickly, leaving nothing behind. A horse tied near the jur snorted and shook its mane. It was smaller than you expected, short, sturdy, compact, but its eyes were sharp, and it looked at you as though it knew you didn't belong here. That was the first time you truly understood. In the Mongol Empire, you didn't just survive the weather or the land. You survived being seen. Breakfast was offered with no ceremony. A bowl of fermented mare's milk, arag, sour and fizzy and unsettling in your mouth. A piece of boiled meat, unseasoned and tough. You chewed in silence as the family watched, their expressions unreadable but not unkind. There was no time for leisure. Life was motion. Stillness was death. The mother gestured for you to follow her. You obeyed. Behind the camp, not far, she crouched beside a stream. The water was partially frozen, a crust of ice broken in places by the trickle beneath. She reached in, scooped it with cupped hands, and washed her face. Then she handed you a rough cloth and pointed to the stream. You mimicked her, shivering as the water touched your skin. There were no mirrors here, no soap, no idle vanity, only routine, repetition, and reverence for the small acts that kept the cold from crawling deeper. Later that day, the sky began to change. What had been a pale blue turned to slate gray, then deeper still. Wind carried a new scent, one of coming snow, sharp and urgent. The eldest son, no more than 12, returned with the sheep. His cheeks were red. His eyes squinted nearly shut against the chill, but he didn't speak. He simply nodded to his mother and began securing the animals in a windbreak of stones and woven reeds. You tried to help, but your hands moved too slowly, your instincts too dulled by comfort and modernity. Your coat was thick but poorly suited to this wind. Your boots soaked through, your breath grew faster. Panic? Faint but rising. Then the storm began. It didn't howl at first, it whispered. A long, low sigh that moved across the plains like a ghost returning to a forgotten grave. Then the snow came, not in flakes, but in sheets, horizontal, blinding. The jur shook under the wind's strength, its leather bindings creaking and the smoke hole flap clattering. Inside, the family gathered in a tight circle, their backs to the wall, heads bowed slightly. The mother handed out bowls again. This time it was a hot broth, faintly meaty, with bits of fat floating on top. You drank gratefully, but the taste was strange. Not spoiled, but foreign. The warmth soothed your stomach, but did nothing for your mind. In that moment, as the wind screamed and the children shivered silently, you felt the weight of your body in the wrong time. Your clothes, your posture, your unspoken expectations, they were all wrong. You didn't belong in this story. You were a visitor in a world where even the air didn't want you. The family didn't scorn you. They pitied you. That night, the storm carried on. You lay under firs, heart racing despite the stillness, wondering how such a quiet, stripped-down life could be so loud in the soul, how a place so empty could feel so full. You were learning the first truth of the Mongol Empire. You weren't meant to last here, not because of cruelty, but because of clarity. This was not a world made for softness. It was made for still eyes and quick hands and the kind of silence that teaches before it warns. You listened to the wind. You closed your eyes and you waited for morning. When the wind finally ceased its tantrum, it did not vanish, it paused. Morning brought with it a light that did not warm, and the hush left in the storm's wake felt heavier than noise. The walls of the jur, damp from the night struggle, exhaled a musty breath as the fabric relaxed. Ice crystals had formed along the inside rim of the smoke hole, glittering faintly in the dawn. The fire in the hearth had long since turned to ash, and the air inside the tent was brittle, like it might snap if anyone spoke too loud. But no one did. The mother rose first, wrapping her thick robe tight, her hair tied into a single braid trailing down her back. With practiced ease, she pulled a goat-hide boot over her foot, then lit a sliver of dry dung on the embers with a single breath, and coaxed the flame back into life. You stirred slowly, aware of every fiber in your body. The muscles in your back had stiffened from the cold. The pads of your fingers were numb, and your lips had cracked during the night. But you were awake. That counted for something. The father entered without warning, brushing the flap aside, snow still clinging to his shoulders. He grunted, a sound not of discontent but of acknowledgement, and began stripping off his outer layers. His eyes swept across you once, then turned back to the hearth. He sat. The mother passed him a warm stone wrapped in cloth. He held it to his chest for a moment, his breath visibly calming. There was no talk of the storm, no marveling at its strength, no lamenting its presence. It had come, and now it was gone. That was all. A piece of bread, hard as bark and darker than the soil, was handed to you. You chewed carefully, each bite an effort. No honey, no butter, no softness. But it filled you. That too counted. The children were already gone. Outside, their voices echoed faintly as they attended to the animals. You stepped out shortly after, wrapping yourself as tightly as you could in the borrowed robe. The land had changed. Snow blanketed the plains, but not evenly. The wind had carved it into dunes and ridges, strange sculptures that made the familiar space around the camp feel foreign. Footprints led to and from the pens where sheep huddled together, breathing as one creature. One of the boys, the younger, waved you over. His hand was small but rough, calloused like old leather. He led you behind a low ridge where the goats had gathered. Without speaking, he showed you the feeding method, piling dried grass and herbs they had stored beneath oilcloth bundles. The goats bleated softly, pushing at each other. The boy showed you how to scatter the feed evenly so no creature would starve by the whim of chance. You tried. Your hands fumbled, your breath came in short clouds, and your balance wavered on the uneven, icy ground. But he did not mock you. He simply moved on to the next task. Throughout the day, you learned the rhythm. It was not written anywhere, not sung or declared, but woven into the hands and eyes of everyone around you. After the animals came water, gathered from the stream, now nearly frozen, chipping at the edges with a carved horn blade. Then drying the hides that had been left out before the storm, checking the cords that tied the jur's base to the anchor stones. Nothing was left undone. There was no margin for neglect. Later, the mother began spinning thread from raw wool. Her fingers moved in a calm, circular rhythm, the spindle dancing like a leaf caught in wind. You sat near her, trying not to shiver. The warmth of the jar returned only slowly, and every bit of heat was earned. She glanced at your hands and handed you a lump of wool, then pointed to her movements. You tried to mimic her. Your hands slipped often, and the thread broke more than once. But she said nothing. She simply took your attempt and spun it into the stronger thread she needed, not erasing your effort, but folding it into her own. Evening came as a dimming of the light, not a setting of the sun. There were no brilliant skies here, no golden hours, just the growing blue, the softening edges of distant hills, the crows settling quietly on the backs of oxen. Inside, the father smoked something in a pipe carved with intricate patterns, wolves and hawks and curling lines that told stories only he remembered. The children returned, their cheeks flushed, but their mood steady. They cleaned their hands in a bowl of snow, shook it off, and knelt around the hearth. The family moved like dancers in an old performance. You were the misplaced step, but not unwelcome, just untrained. Dinner was again meat and broth, this time with wild onions and something bitter that puckered your mouth. You swallowed gratefully. Hunger here was different, not a pang, but a fog that dulled the edges of your thoughts. As night drew in again, you were offered a thicker fur to sleep under. The eldest son handed it to you wordlessly. You nodded, understanding now that here, words were not currency. Action was, endurance was. You lay beneath the heavy weight of the hide, eyes open to the faint cracks in the wooden frame above. The wind had not returned. The silence settled in like an old companion. You began to feel it. Not comfort exactly, but a shedding. The loss of expectation, the erosion of convenience, the beginning of a new kind of awareness, raw and startling. In the stillness, you heard your breath, your heart, and something else beneath both. The rhythm of a world that did not care if you understood it, but would welcome you if you adapted. Outside, wolves howled, far off yet close enough to feel in your spine. You closed your eyes. The third morning greeted you not with light, but with movement. Before the pale rays of sun even touched the snowbanks, the family was already in motion. The mother had risen early to prepare a soft leather pouch filled with dried meat and milk curds. The father stood by the tethered horses, checking saddles and reins with swift, silent gestures. Even the children, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, moved with purposeful rhythm. There was a journey to be made. You were handed a pair of thicker mittens, and the youngest child tugged at your arm, guiding you to the edge of the camp. There stood your mount, a short, muscular horse with a shaggy mane, its breath steaming in the cold air. It pawed at the snow with irritation, sensing your unfamiliarity. The boy pointed at the saddle, then at you, then nodded. It was time to learn. Mounting the Mongol horse was not the elegant process you imagined. The saddle was high, the stirrups small, and the horse impatient. When you finally sat upright, you realized how little control you had. The reins were more symbolic than functional. The horse seemed to move not by command, but by shared understanding. And you as yet shared nothing with it. The father led the way, the children followed. You came last, barely balancing, your fingers tight around the worn leather. The cold had returned, not cruelly, but with quiet persistence. It entered through seams and cuffs, reminding you that nothing here was ever truly warm, only temporarily less cold. The group rode east, across ridges of snow that broke under hoofbeats, past frozen streams that reflected the pale sky like broken mirrors. The wind was gentle today, though it still carried the scent of distance. You didn't know the destination, but no one offered explanation. That was not the way of this land. After some hours, the land shifted. Hills grew steeper, and in the valleys between them, the snow grew thinner. Brown earth peeked through along with patches of dry grass curled like old parchment. You spotted signs of life, rabbit tracks, the distant silhouette of deer, and once a flash of movement as a fox darted behind a rock. But no people, no smoke, just land, rolling and endless. The father finally stopped atop a high ridge. He dismounted, not with flourish, but with habit, and walked forward. There, barely visible beneath a stone cairn, was a small shrine. Simple, weather-worn. A faded piece of red cloth fluttered from one of the stones, tied to a bone post. You watched as he knelt, placed both hands on the earth and lowered his head. The children did the same. Even the horses stood still. The mother removed a strip of silk from her pouch and tied it to a branch nearby. A prayer flag, frayed and whispering in the breeze. You mimicked them slowly, kneeling, placing your hands into the cold ground. There was no need to ask who or what they prayed to. It was not about names. It was about reverence for ancestors, for survival, for the sky that watched and the land that never forgot. After some time, the father rose. He turned without a word, mounted his horse, and began the descent. The ritual was done. The land had been greeted. Now life resumed. On the return journey, your body ached. The saddle pressed against your thighs and spine in unfamiliar ways. The wind, now shifting westward, caught in your eyes and mouth, drying your skin. But you didn't complain. You understood now that words like pain or fatigue had no place here. They were acknowledged in silence, then ignored. Near dusk, as the camp reappeared in the distance, you saw another figure approaching from the opposite direction. A rider, cloaked in dark wool, with a bow slung across his back and a spear upright at his side. The father raised a hand, an open palm, fingers splayed. The rider returned the gesture, then veered toward the camp. Inside the jur that evening, the air was warmer. A larger fire had been built, meat roasted slowly on skewers, dripping fat into the flames. The guests sat cross-legged near the father, exchanging few words. You noticed their glances, the unspoken currents that passed between them, news, agreements, things not said aloud. You listened as they spoke in a tongue you still did not understand, the syllables harsh yet flowing, like wind breaking through tall grass. You felt no exclusion. This world was not shaped for your comfort. Its rhythm was not for sale. Later, when the guest unwrapped his bundle, he revealed a series of small items: a curved blade, a pouch of salt, 2 arrows with red fletching. Gifts or trade, you could not tell. The mother accepted them with a slight nod and placed a round loaf of dried cheese in return. That night, as the guests settled by the hearth, you watched the children huddle together, laughing silently over something you could not see. Their joy was quiet but real, flickering like embers. The jar creaked in the wind again. Outside, the horses stamped the ground, and an owl called once, long and low. You lay beneath the fur, every muscle bruised from the ride, but your mind strangely awake. You thought of the shrine, the stone, the silence, the offering. You thought of the guest, arriving like a shadow and welcomed with no suspicion. You thought of the way everyone moved, not faster, but with greater clarity than you had ever known. In this empire, survival was not about fighting the world. It was about fitting into its unseen folds, its unwritten rules. You did not yet belong, but you were beginning to listen. Dawn arrived as a slow unfolding rather than a sudden revelation. The horizon, still shrouded in indigo and frost, bled gently into pale ash and gold. Inside the jar, the faint crackle of the fire was the only sound for a long while. The guest had already gone when you stirred from sleep. No farewell, no trace. Only an absence in the circle by the hearth and a cooling stone where his cloak had rested. Today began differently. There was tension in the air, not fear, but a tightening, like a string pulled taut. The father stood with his arms crossed near the doorway, his gaze fixed eastward. His eldest son stood beside him, also watching, though for what, you could not tell. The mother packed provisions with practiced hands, her movements brisk, her brow furrowed. Even the youngest child moved with unusual solemnity, carrying gear from one end of the jar to the other, pausing only to glance at the horizon. Something was coming. You did not ask. You only observed. A large hide bag was prepared and tied shut with thick cords. A bow was checked for damage, each string tested, each arrow shaft examined for splits. The father handed the weapon to his son, who accepted it with a silent nod. He was no longer a child, not today. His face bore the calm of one who had been preparing for this since he could walk. Before the sun had fully risen, the father and son departed. No words, just the sound of hoofbeats slowly disappearing into the vast white. The mother stood at the doorway long after they were gone, her hands still and her eyes not blinking. Then she returned to the fire and began to grind dried herbs between 2 stones. You sat nearby, unsure of your place, but aware that movement was necessary now more than ever. That day unfolded in layers of stillness and labor. The mother taught you how to twist sinew into string, wetting it, pulling it tight, wrapping it around your palm until it bit. She did not speak much, but when she did, her words were slow and even, as though they were not just for you, but for the air itself. You repeated her gestures as best you could. Your fingers cramped quickly, unused to such work. She gave no sign of approval or disapproval, only handed you more sinew when the last piece frayed. Outside, the younger boy fed the horses and then busied himself with leather work. He stretched a hide over a curved frame and began to scrape it with a bone blade, careful not to tear the surface. You offered to help. He gave you the bone tool and showed you the motion. Slow, firm strokes, never against the grain. You tried. He watched. When your scraping became too shallow or too deep, he gently corrected your hand, then stepped back again. The rhythm was meditative. It pulled you in. Later, the mother signaled for you both to follow her up a nearby hill. The climb was steep but short, the snow crunching beneath your boots. At the top stood a lone tree, bare, gnarled, and ancient. Around its base were small stones arranged in a rough circle. She knelt and placed a bundle of dried milk curds and herbs there, then bowed her head. The boy did the same. You understood now. This was no mere superstition. It was conversation with the land, an offering to those who had walked it before. You followed their movements. It felt wrong to speak. Your breath caught in your throat, not from exertion, but from something quieter, an awareness of presence. When you returned to the Jarrah, dusk was already beginning to fall. The sky shifted into muted purples and deepening blue. No word yet from the riders. The fire was rebuilt, and dried roots were added to the broth for flavor. You drank slowly, grateful for the warmth. That night, sleep came late. The Jarrah was quieter than before. Even the children's laughter had faded into cautious whispers. The youngest boy pressed close to his mother. She braided his hair with slow fingers, murmuring something too soft for you to hear. A lullaby, perhaps, or a prayer. You lay staring at the ceiling, the curved beams meeting at the center like spokes of a wheel. The storm was gone, but its silence lingered. In this world, the lack of noise was never empty. It was watchful, waiting. Your body was sore, your eyes dry, but your mind remained restless. You thought of the two riders, slicing through the plain like needles through silk, of the shrine beneath the cairn, of the arrow with red fletching the guest had left behind. A warning, perhaps, or a message meant for those who could read its language. You had begun to understand one thing. Here, nothing happened by accident. Every gesture was weighted. Every silence carried a meaning that could not be translated, only absorbed. You did not ask questions. You let the stillness settle over you, a second skin. Outside, a fox barked in the distance, sharp, solitary, and then gone. You listened to the breath of the earth and waited. The fifth day began before light had dared to break the horizon. A low humming sound pulled you from sleep. Not quite a voice, not quite a melody, but a vibration deep in the bones of the Jarrah. The mother was awake, kneeling by the fire, whispering to it in the same low tones you had heard only once before, when she made her offering beneath the tree. The flame flickered, uncertain, as though deciding whether to stay or retreat. She fed it patiently. Bits of dry dung, a few slivers of wood, and a small cloth pouch she opened carefully. Crushed herbs that carried the faint, sweet scent of juniper and smoke. As the fire strengthened, so too did the mother's posture. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted slightly. Whatever shadow had settled over the Jarrah last night, she was resisting it now. The younger boy was still asleep, curled deep into the furs, his breath shallow but steady. You rose quietly, wrapped yourself against the cold, and stepped outside. The sky was a deep violet, and the stars were still out, sharp and glittering, unblurred by city lights or clouds. The snow shimmered in patches where the moon's glow lingered, and your boots left crisp impressions with each step. No wind, no sound. Even the horses were silent. You walked a short way up the hill to where the lone tree stood, its branches motionless, clawing upward like hands caught in prayer. The offerings from yesterday remained undisturbed. Something about the sight, those small deliberate signs of reverence against the vastness, made you pause longer than you meant to. When you returned, the boy was awake. He sat cross-legged near the hearth, tying knots in a length of sinew. He looked up only once, then returned to his task. The mother handed you a bowl of broth and a small piece of hard bread. You thanked her with a nod and ate slowly. The warmth in your chest lingered. Just after midday, a figure appeared on the horizon. The mother saw it first. She stepped outside and stood still, her hand shading her eyes. You followed her gaze. At first, it looked like a bird, then a shadow, then clearly a rider. The boy jumped to his feet and ran for the ridge. You stayed back, unsure. The mother waited, her hands clenched, then loosened. The wind began to stir again. When the rider drew near, your breath caught. It was the son, alone. His horse was exhausted, foam crusted at its mouth, legs trembling. The boy's face was pale and cut by the wind. His cloak was torn at the shoulder, but he did not fall. He dismounted carefully and handed his bow to his mother. She looked it over slowly. One arrow missing, blood, faint but visible on the grip. She said nothing. The boy turned to you then, eyes unreadable, not asking for help, not looking for comfort, simply seeing if you understood. You didn't, not fully, but something in your chest shifted. That afternoon, no one spoke much. The son cleaned his horse, checked its hooves, rubbed a balm into the animal's legs. The mother boiled a thicker broth and placed extra fat into it. The boy drank in silence. Then he slept. You asked no questions. You gathered water from the stream, now a narrow vein of movement under the ice. You scraped hides with the younger child. You turned the furs hanging outside so the snow wouldn't weigh them unevenly. These were small acts, but they were seen. Near evening, the father returned. Unlike his son, he did not appear weary. His horse moved easily, and the man's face was calm. But his arrival shifted the air inside the ger. He brought news without speaking. The mother met his eyes, and after a long pause, she nodded. She brought out another bowl. That night, he spoke more than usual. He described the presence of strangers, riders not of their kin, not from their usual paths. Scouts, likely. Their movement was too clean for merchants, too loose for raiders. Their armor was not Mongol-made. Their direction was uncertain. The children listened in stillness. Even the youngest did not drift away. Every detail mattered. Later, the father unwrapped something from his coat, a strip of leather, stained and marked with small cuts. A message, though not written in words. Symbols and slashes, patterns of information passed from one rider to another. A code, alive only to those who had lived with it since birth. The mother studied it carefully, then burned it in the hearth. The family began packing just after nightfall, not in panic, in rhythm. The ger could be collapsed quickly, the frame folded, the felt rolled. Provisions were sorted, what to carry, what to leave. The father murmured to the horses as he checked each saddle. The children gathered their few belongings. A carved comb, a slingshot, a pouch of berries dried and shriveled. Not a single item was wasted. You helped where you could, now more confident in the unspoken language of motion. You folded rugs, coiled rope, tightened leather ties. No one told you what to do. You found the work through observation. The moon climbed higher, cold and full. It lit the snow in a way that made the plain seem less like land and more like a sleeping sea. When the ger was finally gone, the site left nearly bare. The family rested briefly. They sat together on folded rugs, watching the fire burn low for the last time in that place. You understood now that the empire was not held by cities or walls. It was held by motion, memory, silence, and you were moving within it. The caravan departed just before dawn, when the snow was still blue with sleep and the stars had not yet vanished into the pale dome of morning. The wind had picked up again, not fierce but steady, brushing the faces of the travelers, lifting the hems of cloaks, combing the manes of horses like unseen fingers. The father led, his silhouette a dark shape against the eastern light. His bow rested across his back, quivers swaying gently with the rhythm of his horse's stride. The eldest son followed close, his eyes sharper now, his movements precise and mature in a way they had not been even 2 days before. The mother rode third, the younger child nestled before her, wrapped tightly in furs, his eyes peering out but quiet. You brought up the rear, astride the smaller of the horses, its breath forming ghosts with every exhale. The land was open and unchanged, no signposts, no roads, just the gentle rise and fall of frozen terrain stretching in all directions. Yet the family moved with surety. The father would glance at the horizon, at the sky, at the shadow of distant hills, and then shift direction slightly. There was no map but memory. For the first hour, no one spoke. The creak of leather, the crunch of hooves on snow, and the occasional snort of a horse were the only sounds. Then the mother began to hum, soft, circular tones that carried no lyrics, only pattern. It wasn't a song meant for entertainment. It was an anchor, a quiet tether for the child she held and for herself. You found comfort in that sound. It filled the emptiness with a presence gentler than words. By mid-morning, the caravan passed a frozen river. The horses paused to drink from a small break in the ice, and the family dismounted to stretch their legs. The father checked the hooves for cracks, rubbing snow and dirt from them with a handful of cloth. The mother unpacked a pouch of food, dried meat, hardened curds, and a bit of honey wrapped in bark paper. The eldest boy split a piece of the meat and offered it to you. You took it with a nod. The gesture needed no embellishment. From the hill nearby, the father scanned the horizon again. This time he crouched. He pulled something from the folds of his coat, a tube of polished bone, and held it to one eye. You had seen such a thing once, long ago, in a museum called a distance lens. But this was not glass. It was ancient design, perhaps even ritual. He held it steady for a long time. Then he stood, slowly. The group moved again, this time faster. The terrain grew uneven, clumps of rock, patches of brush visible even through the snow. The horses handled it well, but the silence deepened. It wasn't until the second rest that you noticed the trail. Not footprints, too scattered and wind-washed, but the faint, rhythmic compression in the snow. Someone, or many someones, had passed this way, and not long ago. The father examined it in silence. He placed his fingers in one of the impressions, then stood and looked westward. The trail curved that way, faint but undeniable. Then he turned and led the group south instead, into a series of small valleys nestled between low ridges. By sunset, you reached shelter. Not a village, there were none nearby, but a cluster of stone outcroppings where others had camped before. Scorch marks still blackened the stones where old fires had burned. Bones lay scattered nearby, animal bones, cracked and cleaned. Signs of habitation, but not threat. The family worked swiftly. A temporary camp was set with tarps and ropes. No jar here, only a windbreak of stretched hide supported by poles and stone like a tense ghost. The mother kindled a fire, small but warm. The father took the eldest son and rode off again, not far, perhaps to survey or to hunt. You helped the mother unpack the furs and arrange them near the fire, your hands stiffer now from the cold, but more capable than they had been days before. The child, half asleep, murmured to himself in a sing-song voice, tracing lines in the snow with a stick. His words were not playful. They sounded more like recitations, chants perhaps, remembered verses. Night fell quickly. The cold deepened, wrapping around every breath. When the father returned, he brought back a pair of hairs slung across his saddle. He did not smile, but his eyes softened when he saw the fire already lit, the camp prepared. Dinner was quiet but filling. Meat roasted on spears over the low flames and the fat hissed into the coals. The eldest son ate beside you, his expression calm, contemplative, no longer watchful. He had begun to see you not as a burden, but as something almost useful, almost. That night, the stars returned, more vivid than ever. They blanketed the sky in dizzying numbers. Constellations you could not name burned cold and bright above you. The father sat apart from the fire, bow across his knees, head tilted skyward. His silhouette looked as though it belonged to another century. Perhaps it did. You slept beneath the stars, wrapped in furs, your head resting against your arm. The wind passed over the camp like a breath over still water. And for the first time, you dreamed not of the world you had left behind, but of the land you were in, its distances, its silence, its slow and sacred rhythm. The seventh day broke with the scent of thawed earth and distant fire. Though the snow still clung to shadows and hollows, the morning air carried a different weight, less of frost, more of anticipation. The kind of air that stirred birds from branches and made horses lift their heads, ears twitching at things unseen. You woke before the others, stirred not by noise but by quiet, a deeper stillness than usual. The sky overhead was clear, washed pale by early light, and the rocks surrounding the camp had shed their icy crust. You sat up slowly, the fur slipping from your shoulders. A breath hung in the air, not from your lips, but from something warmer nearby. The horses were already alert, standing in a loose semicircle at the edge of the camp, their bodies tense, not afraid, not restless, attentive, watching. Then the father stirred. He rose with practiced quiet, pulling his bow close, and motioned for silence without looking at you. The rest of the family followed soon after. Even the child did not whimper or ask. The mother packed the small fire away, scattering ashes into the snow with her gloved hand. The eldest son knelt on one knee, scanning the hills. Something was near. A sound came next, not loud but distinct. A bell, soft, rhythmic, metal tapping against metal. Then hooves, multiple, unhurried. A procession emerged from between the hills. 3 riders, dressed in long cloaks lined with fur, their faces mostly hidden beneath layers of cloth and leather. Their horses were finer than yours, taller, slimmer, their coats brushed and oiled. One of the riders carried a banner tucked beneath his arm. The fabric furled tight, its design not yet shown. No one spoke. The father walked out alone, his bow slung but unstrung, hands open at his sides. One of the riders dismounted. A woman, her face weathered, lined from wind and sun. She stepped forward and removed one glove, then raised her hand palm out, fingers slightly curled. The father did the same. Then they embraced, briefly, without sentiment, but with gravity. She whispered something in his ear, and he nodded once, then looked back at the camp. They had met before. Soon the rest of the riders dismounted, and the entire family stood nearby. The woman unwrapped the banner and let it unfurl in the morning breeze. A strip of dark wool marked with 3 vertical slashes dyed in ochre. Not a symbol you recognized, but clearly one of meaning. The mother touched it lightly with her fingers and closed her eyes. The group sat in a circle soon after. Bread was passed and warmed milk mixed with herbs. The fire was rekindled for their arrival, and meat was offered without fanfare. You watched quietly, unsure if you should sit or stand, but the eldest son gestured toward the circle. You took your place. Their conversation was sparse, but filled with weight. Glances, nods, long pauses where meaning ripened in silence. You understood little of the language, its cadence sharp and fluid, but certain names repeated. Altan, Sogolon, Bayalag, and the name of the river you had crossed 2 days ago. There was concern. The woman's voice sharpened when she spoke of movement west of the stones, and one of the other riders thumped his palm against his thigh in frustration. The father listened without interruption, his fingers lightly brushing the shaft of his arrow as if thinking through it. When the talk paused, the woman turned to you. Her eyes, lined and unreadable, studied your face as if weighing it against something ancient. She said a single word, sharp and short. You did not answer, unsure. The eldest boy leaned closer and whispered it again. Not a name, a question. It meant outsider. You nodded slowly. The woman smiled faintly. Not warmth, not mockery. Recognition. She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out a small item. An amulet carved of bone, shaped like a curved fang with a symbol etched near its base. She held it towards you. Hesitating, you accepted it. The bone was smooth and cool, the etching precise. A spiral surrounded by 3 lines. The same symbol, you realized, was faintly stitched into the woman's cloak. You looked up and she nodded once, then turned back to the others. By late morning, the riders were gone. They vanished over the ridge as swiftly as they had come, their banner tucked away once more. The father turned to the family, gave a single word of instruction, and preparations began anew. The direction had changed. You were now heading east. As you helped repack the supplies, the eldest boy tapped your arm and pointed at the amulet still clutched in your hand. Then he pointed at the center of your chest. Wear it. You tied it around your neck with a strip of leather, and as it settled against your skin, you felt its weight. Not heavy, but steady. A mark, perhaps, or a test. You didn't know what it meant, but it was yours now, and the road once again was calling. The land turned strange as you traveled east. Where once the horizon had been a flat, uninterrupted swell of snow and sky, it now broke into jagged shapes, low, uneven hills, boulders that jutted from the earth like buried monuments, and patches of scrub that clawed upward through frost. The wind no longer blew with the freedom of the open steppe. It whispered between stones, carried secrets through narrow valleys, and made the horses twitch at shadows that didn't move. The father's posture grew tauter with each mile. He did not speak, but his gaze swept the land more often. The mother rode close behind, her expression unreadable. The child was quiet, his hands gripping the saddle tightly. The eldest son carried an arrow nocked to his bow now, though he did not draw. Even you felt the change, not danger exactly, but a hush in the bones. awaiting. On the second day through this harsher terrain, snow gave way to patches of soil, hard packed, brown, and dry. Ice crusted only the shadows now. The horses stepped more carefully here, their hooves striking stone more often than snow. You saw bones along the path, not many and not fresh, ribs and jawbones, weathered and gnawed, half buried beneath wind-blown dust. The eldest boy glanced at them only once, then continued. At midday, you reached a pass between two steep ridges. A cairn of stones marked its entrance, deliberately built, adorned with a single strip of cloth, sun-faded to a pale ochre. The mother dismounted, approached the cairn, and laid 3 beads at its base, one red, one black, one white. The child did not look away. Neither did you. As you passed through, the sun dimmed, hidden behind a thick haze that was not yet cloud. The air grew drier. Your breath no longer steamed as it had days before. The wind here carried grit that clung to skin and cracked the corners of your mouth. Still, you pressed forward. By nightfall, you reached an old way station, a ruin of stone walls barely taller than a man's chest. No roof, no gate, just the skeleton of a place once known. The father motioned to halt. This would be your rest for the night. You helped unpack, though your hands were slower today. The dust and dryness had crept into your lungs, and your back ached from the unfamiliar terrain. Still, you found rhythm in setting the stakes, weighing down the hides, arranging the firestones. Inside the broken walls, the air was still. The fire flickered low, struggling against the thin wind that slipped through the gaps in stone. You sat close to it, and the warmth felt fragile, earned, not guaranteed. That evening, the father spoke more than usual, not to you, but to his family. He described the land ahead, not in distances or directions, but in memory. He spoke of a ravine where water once flowed but no longer did, of a tree struck by lightning that still stood, hollow but alive, of a stone carved with the faces of forgotten chiefs, weathered now to near featurelessness. The children listened. The eldest asked questions, brief, pointed, respectful. The father answered with the care of one who had once asked those same questions. You listened too, not to understand, but to witness. The Mongol world did not offer its knowledge openly. It revealed itself through stories wrapped in landscape, through gesture and silence, through what was chosen to be remembered. Later, the mother took a small bundle from her pack and unwrapped it slowly. Inside were dried roots, thin as twine, and a blackened kettle. She brewed something over the fire, and its scent filled the camp, sharp, earthy, with a hint of sweetness. One by one, she poured the drink into small bowls. Everyone drank. When she handed one to you, her eyes lingered briefly on the amulet at your chest. The liquid was bitter and thick. It coated your throat and warmed your stomach with surprising speed. Not a pleasure, but a necessity. It kept the cold of the bones away. That night, no one sang. No one told tales. The stars were hidden behind thin veils of cloud, and the fire burned low, flickering shadows against the broken walls. You lay close to the others, wrapped in furs, the amulet resting against your chest like a second heartbeat. In your sleep, dreams came, not of your past life, not of cities or voices, or the warmth of electric light. You dreamt of riders on the plain, faceless and swift, of wind carrying names you could not pronounce, of stone carved by hands long gone, watching, waiting, of the amulet now glowing faintly in the dark, its spiral turning, pulling inward. You woke before dawn. The fire was nearly out. The wind had shifted again, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a hawk cried once into the gray morning. The 9th day began under a sky of ash-gray stillness, neither storming nor clear. The clouds hung low like a lid, pressing the air into silence. There was no sunrise, only a slow brightening that hinted at daybreak without ever fully claiming it. The old way station, with its crumbling stone bones, seemed to recede behind you as the caravan moved forward, swallowed again by the vast and waking land. Today, the world grew harder. The path wound through a series of dry ravines, their walls etched by long-forgotten floods. The horses moved cautiously, their hooves echoing against brittle stone. In places, narrow ledges forced you to dismount and lead your horse by hand, fingers numb against the coarse reins, boots slipping slightly on gravel and frost. Yet no one complained. There was no space here for discomfort, only movement. You began to feel the land in your muscles, each step a quiet negotiation with terrain that yielded nothing freely. Your breath was shallower now, not because of fear or fatigue, but because of altitude. The air had grown thinner. When you looked to the east, hills had lifted their shoulders higher, and beyond them, a jagged line of peaks rose like old teeth into the sky. By midday, the caravan reached a natural amphitheater, wide, sunken, and ringed by tall stones that leaned in toward one another as if whispering. The father signaled to stop. No words, only the raised hand, palm open. The family dismounted and began to unpack not the usual camp tools, but a smaller bundle, carefully wrapped and tied. The mother unrolled it on a flat stone. Inside were items you had not seen before: an iron knife with a carved handle, a strip of white linen, a small clay bowl, and a pouch filled with black powder. You watched as they began a ritual. The father knelt, drawing a line in the dust with the tip of the knife. Then 3 stones were placed at its center, one on top of the other, forming a cairn the size of a hand. The eldest son lit a small fire in the clay bowl, using the powder to catch the flame. It smelled of burnt sage and something bitterer, something almost metallic. The mother dipped the linen in a mixture of melted snow and ashes, then wrung it out. With it, she wiped each family member's face, starting with the child, then the eldest son, then herself, and finally the father. When she approached you, she paused. Her gaze searched your eyes, not for permission, but for presence. You nodded. She wiped your brow gently. The cloth was cold and the scent sharp. As it touched your skin, something stirred inside. Not memory, but a sense of being seen, not just as a visitor, but as something newly named. The father spoke then in low tones, words slow and clear. His voice did not rise. It was not for the sky or the stones. It was for those who had gone before. You could not understand the language, but you recognized the cadence, an offering, a promise, and a request. When the fire burned low, the ashes were scattered to the wind. The cairn was left standing. The caravan did not linger. That afternoon, the terrain changed again. The ravines widened into flatlands of dry grass and stone. The wind returned, stronger now, sweeping across the plains with a chill that sliced through layers. Birds circled overhead, hawks perhaps or vultures, always distant, never still. You rode beside the eldest son. He said little, but his glance toward the sky was frequent. Once he pulled his horse to a halt and pointed to a ridge far ahead, a pillar of smoke, thin but deliberate. The father stopped the group to observe. He dismounted, shielding his eyes, watching the smoke shape. It was not from a wildfire, too narrow, too controlled, a signal or a camp, perhaps both. After a short discussion, it was decided the caravan would shift south, skirting the ridge. No unnecessary risks. Not today. By evening, your path had dipped into a shallow valley sheltered on all sides. Sparse trees grew here, twisted and short, their bark pale and flaking. Among them, the mother found dry wood, a rarity since leaving the snowy plains. She built a fire that danced high and steady, casting long shadows across the camp. Dinner was quieter than usual. The child curled into sleep early. The eldest son sat polishing arrowheads with a stone, his hands methodical, his thoughts elsewhere. The father whispered to the mother, pointing once toward the mountains. Later, as you lay beneath the stars, now visible again, crisp and cold, you took the amulet from under your shirt and held it in your hand. It had warmed with your body's heat. Its spiral pattern caught the firelight in ways that made it appear to move, though it did not. You traced it slowly with your thumb, wondering what message it carried, what part of this land had made it, and for what reason. Around you, the camp rested. Above, the stars wheeled in their ancient silence, and somewhere beyond, in the folds of mountain and memory, something waited. The 10th day began with a frost that glittered on every surface. The fire, though covered with stones the night before, had smoldered to nothing. Ice clung to the edges of your blanket, and even the horses stood motionless, steam curling from their nostrils in fine spirals. It was a silence too clean for sleep, the kind that brushed your ears and demanded stillness. The father had risen first, as always. He stood with one knee bent, hands resting atop his saddle, watching the north. The mountain range had crept closer in the night, as though the land itself had shifted. Now, the jagged spires dominated the eastern sky, their crowns sharp with snow and their bellies wrapped in mist. The pass, the eldest son said, would be near. It would be narrow and no longer empty. Breakfast was minimal. A few handfuls of barley boiled into a paste and eaten from fingers. The mother placed a few crushed leaves into the kettle and passed around a drink as dark as pine resin. It tasted of smoke and salt, but it warmed you quickly. The child didn't speak much today. His eyes were wide and alert, his hands clenched around the edges of his cloak. He stayed close to the mother's side, where her shadow fell over him. As the camp was packed, you noticed something different. The father carefully bound a small bundle of herbs to the bridle of his horse, then another to the back of the eldest son's saddle. When he approached yours, he held the third out to you, a mix of twisted root and dried stalk, bound by red string. He nodded toward the front strap. You tied it in silence. It was not a charm, it was a mark, a signal to whatever spirits or forces dwelled near the pass that you came with clarity, not concealment. The path led upward. At first, it was a slow incline, passing through a forest of thin, weather-bent trees. Their trunks creaked even when there was no wind, as if remembering burdens long since vanished. Birds darted overhead, small, gray things with sharp wings that moved like shadows through branches. Occasionally, you saw signs of larger creatures, hoofprints, stripped bark, droppings that steamed faintly in the cold. But nothing stirred. By noon, the trees fell away. The ground was now bare stone and brittle lichen. Snow clung to crevices, and the wind pressed harder, funneled by the narrowing walls. You rode single file now, the path no wider than a body, with sheer rock rising to your right and falling steeply to your left. The horses sensed the change and moved cautiously. Then, midway through the pass, you saw the stones. Not random, not fallen, placed. Stacked in pairs along the edge of the path, one every 10 paces, each marked with a painted symbol. Spirals, crosshatches, circles bisected with arrows. No two the same. The mother whispered something and pressed her hand to her chest. The father lifted his chin slightly, not in challenge, but acknowledgement. The eldest son reached for his bow, not to draw it, but to ready his grip. These were border stones, not of territory, but of reverence. You passed them slowly, and the silence grew thicker. Even the wind seemed to lessen. The world held its breath. The father motioned for the group to stop. He dismounted, walked to one of the stones, and placed a strip of leather upon it, plain, but folded 3 times. Then he turned back to you, and without words gestured forward. You went first. Your horse's hooves clicked on the bare rock. The path twisted sharply, then rose. At the highest point, the ground leveled briefly into a saddle ridge, wide enough for the group to gather. There, against the horizon, stood a structure. It was not a temple, nor a camp, just a single standing stone, taller than a man, weathered and cracked with lines etched deep into its surface. Around its base were offerings, animal skulls, bone charms, woven ribbons faded by sun and storm. It had no name, but it had presence. The father approached it with care. He placed both palms flat upon the stone, bowed his head, and whispered something in the old tongue. The others followed, including the child, who stood on tiptoe to reach the surface. When the mother finished her gesture, she stepped aside, and the father looked to you. It was your turn. You stepped forward, the amulet warm against your chest. As your hands touched the stone, a strange stillness washed over you. Not cold, not warmth, something deeper. You felt for a moment the breath of those who had stood here before. Riders from centuries ago, wanderers, hunters, exiles, all who had passed through this pass and lived to be remembered, and those who had not. You whispered nothing, but the stone seemed to hear anyway. When you stepped back, the group was silent. The father gave one nod. Then the descent began. The pass sloped downward into a basin shrouded in mist, the trees returning in thicker, darker groves. The light faded sooner here, not from the setting sun, but from the narrowing sky above. The air was rich with pine and wet moss. Birds called in brief, lonely cries. When you made camp that night, it was beneath a canopy of branches dripping with melted snow. The fire struggled, but stayed lit. The family moved slowly, their limbs heavy with something unspoken. You lay under your fur, the amulet still at your chest, your mind turning over what the stone had held. Not words, not meaning, but memory, and perhaps something waiting to be remembered. The 11th morning arrived with a shiver of birdsong. It was soft and infrequent, the kind of sound that stitched the waking forest together without drawing attention. You lay still beneath your blanket of fur and hide, listening to the distant fluting calls, the faint rustle of a breeze high in the branches, and the subtle movement of the horses nearby, their bodies shifting against the chill. When you emerged from sleep, the camp was already stirring. The mother was crouched by the fire, coaxing a slow flame from damp wood with dried moss and a hollow reed. Her breath was steady, lips tight against the reed, and each exhale fanned the embers until they caught. Beside her, the younger child was threading a cord through a pouch of stones, each one etched with a faint, shallow mark. He wasn't playing, he was practicing something. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wet bark. Mist curled low over the ground, drifting between the trees like smoke. You felt it cling to your skin, to the edges of your sleeves, to your breath. This forest was no place of warmth, but neither was it hostile. It simply existed with indifference, ancient and alert. The father stood apart from the group, sharpening a long knife on a flat stone. His movements were deliberate. Each draw of the blade along the edge of the stone was followed by a pause, a glance at the horizon, and a quiet listening. Not to sound, but to something deeper. The eldest son prepared the horses, checking each hoof, adjusting straps, and testing the knots that bound the bundles. He murmured to them as he worked, not in comfort, but in rhythm. His words were part of the motion. Today's journey was slower. The trees grew denser, their roots thick across the path like coiled muscle. Branches clawed at the sky above, letting in only narrow shafts of light. The horses moved single file, careful of their steps. The caravan wound its way through the forest like a seam being stitched between two worlds. As the day deepened, you began to notice signs, deliberate marks carved into trees, sometimes barely more than a notch, sometimes deeper grooves forming circles or spirals. The mother pointed to one such mark as you passed it, then held up two fingers, then pointed east. You understood. These were messages, left behind by others, warnings or waypoints. At midday, the trees opened briefly into a clearing where stones had been piled into low walls, no higher than a knee, tracing a circular pattern. At the center stood a pole, cracked at its base, wrapped with old silk that fluttered in the wind. Here, the caravan stopped. The father dismounted and walked the circle, once, twice. Then he knelt beside the pole and whispered something you couldn't hear. The mother did not follow. She unpacked a narrow wooden box, unwrapped its oiled cloth, and revealed inside a flute carved from bone. She handed it to the eldest son. He stood, lifted the flute to his lips, and played. The sound was low, uneven at first. A single note that quivered in the cold, then another, slightly higher, then a phrase. The tune was not beautiful by any measure, not melodic or grand, but it was old, it carried weight. The trees seemed to lean toward it, listening. Even the wind paused. You sat very still. When he finished, he bowed toward the pole, then returned the flute to his mother. She wrapped it again without ceremony. No one explained the ritual. They simply moved on. By late afternoon, the forest began to change. The trees thinned. The path widened. You began to see signs of old passage, ruts in the earth, the bones of broken carts, shattered pottery glinting in the loam. Centuries old, perhaps, but not forgotten. The land here bore memory like a scar. As the sun dipped low, the caravan emerged from the forest into a hollow where reeds grew thick and tall. A small stream ran through it, its water brown with silt but moving swiftly. The father knelt beside it, dipped his hands into the water, and tasted it. Then he nodded. You would camp here tonight. Tents were erected instead of the familiar jarrah frame, their leather flaps stitched to poles that bent slightly in the wind. The fire took longer to start, fed by reeds and twisted branches. When it caught, it gave off a strange scent, earthy and sweet, with a bitterness that lingered in the throat. That evening, the mother told a story. She didn't announce it, she simply began speaking, her voice calm, woven with silence. It was about a girl who followed a fox into a cave and came out in another season, where no one knew her name. The fox had taken something from her, not her voice, not her face, but her memory of what she loved. So she wandered, not searching for her home, but searching for the shape of her own longing. The child listened wide-eyed, clutching his furs. The eldest son said nothing, but watched the fire with narrowed eyes. The father closed his breathing slow and even. And you sat there, unsure why the story settled into your chest like snow, quiet, weightless, and impossibly cold. When it ended, no one asked questions. Stories here were not for answers. You lay down that night to the murmur of the stream, the rustle of reeds, and the distant cry of something in the trees, neither bird nor beast. The amulet at your chest pulsed with the warmth of your body, a spiral that had begun to feel less foreign. You did not dream of home. You dreamt of the flute, of the standing stone, and of a fox waiting at the edge of a forgotten cave. By the 12th morning, the reeds had stiffened with frost. Their tips were tipped white, quivering gently with the hush of a breeze that smelled faintly of iron and old water. The stream beside the camp had darkened, running deeper and slower now, its banks crusted with tiny crystals. Overhead, a veil of thin clouds stretched across the sky, giving the light a pale, strained quality. The world seemed to hold its breath. The camp was quiet. The family moved carefully, without their usual rhythm. The father woke first, not to sharpen his blade or tend the fire, but to climb the ridge above the hollow. He stood there a long time, a silhouette against the softened light, his figure outlined by the sky. When he returned, he spoke briefly with the mother. She nodded, then knelt to begin packing. No one asked questions. There was no need. A decision had been made. You rode with the eldest son that day. The reeds gave way to open marshland, damp and uneven, where the ground sloshed under hoof and footprints filled with water before you could look back at them. Birds rose in slow bursts from the shallows, long-legged cranes and herons that called out in sharp, almost human cries before vanishing into the sky. The path wound north now. The father had shifted direction after surveying the ridge. You did not know why, but you trusted the silence between his steps. This was not avoidance. It was preparation. By midday, the marsh ended abruptly, replaced by a stretch of black soil cracked with cold. The earth here had once been turned, tilled and seeded perhaps, many years ago. You saw the bones of fence posts, the suggestion of furrows, the vague rectangular lines of what might once have been a dwelling. The wind moved through it without resistance, and the silence deepened. The mother dismounted beside one such shape and knelt. She touched the soil, then lifted a small shard of pottery from the dirt. She held it to the light. It bore a faint red line, a stroke of paint or dye long faded. She placed it back into the earth and rose without a word. You moved on. The land climbed steadily until the view widened again. A shallow valley opened before you, shaped like a bowl turned to catch the sky. At its center stood a cluster of low mounds, earth and stone built into strange forms, rounded, uneven, and covered in moss. They were not dwellings, they were burial sites. Here the family stopped. No fire was built, no food was unpacked. The father led the horses in a slow arc around the mounds, his hand on each beast's neck, calming them. The animals responded with stillness, their ears laid back, their breath shallow. Even the child sensed something. He clung to the mother's cloak and stared at the ground. One by one, the family approached the central mound. They placed offerings at its base, bits of bread, beads, coins, worn smooth by time. The eldest son removed a feather from a pouch and laid it atop the mound. Then he stepped back and waited. The father motioned to you. You hesitated, then approached. You had no offering. Nothing the land would recognize, but you knelt anyway and placed your palm against the earth. It was cold and dry, yet not empty. Beneath your hand you felt not heat but pressure, as if the mound was breathing just slowly enough to be missed by all but the stillest hearts. You stood and stepped away. That evening, the camp was built at the valley's edge, beyond the sight of the mounds. The fire was small, shielded with stones, its light low and careful. Dinner was simple and eaten in near silence. The father spoke only once, describing in hushed tones the names of those buried there. You did not understand the words, but their cadence marked lineage, names passed down, stories preserved in breath. The mother offered a soft song, no longer than a minute. It began like a lullaby and ended like a prayer. The night grew cold. You wrapped yourself tightly, the amulet warm against your chest, the spiral etched there, catching what little light the fire offered. Around you, the land listened. Sleep came quietly. No dreams this time, only a long, slow falling into silence. On the 13th day, the wind returned. It did not howl or scream. It whispered low across the valley, threading itself through grass and moss, through the dark folds of the burial mounds, lifting the edges of cloaks and brushing against the napes of necks. It carried the scent of distant pine and dry ash, and something else harder to name, like the taste of old stone or the breath of untouched places. You woke to it, a slight movement of air across your cheek, and when you opened your eyes, the fire had burned to a fine white dust. The family was already preparing. The mother worked with more urgency today. Her hands moved quickly over bundles, inspecting each one, tightening the leather wrappings. The father moved from horse to horse, checking hooves, murmuring to each beast in tones low and intimate. The eldest son carried the saddles to the ridge's edge, laying them out as if in anticipation. Even the child, often the last to rise, was already awake, helping to fold the sleeping skins and roll them into neat coils. You joined them, your limbs stiff, your breath catching in the chill. There was no discussion. The mounds had been honored, the land acknowledged. It was time to move on. You followed the ridge for some time, the sky growing brighter but remaining overcast. The horizon shimmered with haze. Distant hills blurred like memories of mountains. At intervals, the father would stop and scan the path ahead. His brow remained furrowed, his posture tense. The eldest son rode ahead for stretches at a time, disappearing behind crests before returning in silence, his bow never far from hand. By midday, you passed an old monument, a tall, fractured slab of stone rising from a field of shattered rock. Its surface was worn smooth, the carvings on its face nearly vanished, yet still faint lines remained. A horse, a rider, a wheel. Around it, the ground was bare, not from wind, but from respect. No one dared step too close. The family dismounted here. Each one approached the stone in turn. The mother knelt and laid a sprig of dried flowers, long preserved and now brittle at its base. The father removed a thin leather cord from his wrist and tied it around a low branch of the gnarled tree growing behind the stone. The son, solemn, pressed his palm flat to the carving and bowed his head. You followed quietly. Standing before it, the stone felt like a voice half swallowed by time. Its silence was not emptiness, but restraint. Something held back, not because it was forgotten, but because it was sacred. You reached out and touched the carved wheel. The stone was cold and rough beneath your fingers. Still, something within it stirred. The journey resumed without words. That afternoon, the sky began to shift. Clouds thickened, rolling in slow, heavy waves. The wind no longer whispered. It pressed. The horses became restless, their ears flicking, their hooves striking the ground with impatient rhythm. The father pulled his mount to a halt and gestured toward the hills. The caravan veered sharply northwest. There, in the distance, a formation rose, a shallow cave set into the face of a low cliff. From afar, it looked like a scar in the earth. As you approached, its shape became clearer, a long mouth, half collapsed, with smooth rock forming a natural awning above it. Shelter. The family moved swiftly to secure it. Inside, the cave was dry and shallow, but wide enough to shelter the horses and all 5 of you. The air inside was cold but still. The fire was built deeper in, its smoke curling out and vanishing into the darkening wind. The mother laid dried roots near the flames to soften. The child sat quietly near the wall, tracing a spiral into the dust with a stick. The storm arrived just after dusk. It did not announce itself with fury. It came with weight, a slow piling of pressure in the air, then snow, heavy, wet, and constant. It fell in thick layers, silencing the land, smothering all sound beyond the cave. The sky was a blank sheet above the entrance, and soon the world outside ceased to exist in any clear form. Inside, the fire cracked gently. The family sat close, their bodies relaxed but their eyes alert. The father spoke again that night, in the low tone he reserved for important things. He spoke of a lake beyond the hills, frozen in winter, clear and glass-like in summer, of a temple carved into the cliffs at its shore, where smoke rose not from fire, but from incense, and the wind carried prayers away into the mountains. He said no more than a few sentences, but the silence that followed was reverent. Later, the mother took out a square of dark blue cloth and unfolded it carefully. Inside were 6 smooth stones, each carved with a different mark. She laid them in a circle, one by one, then paused. The eldest son added a 7th, a plain stone, uncarved, fresh from the earth. The mother said a word you didn't know and turned her eyes to you. She motioned for you to choose one. You looked at the stones, their markings strange but not uninviting. The spiral, the cross, the wave, the eye, the claw, the flame. Your hand moved without thinking. You picked the stone marked with the eye, an oval etched with a single line down its center. The mother smiled faintly, took the stone, and placed it in the center of the circle. Then, slowly, she wrapped them all again and placed them back in the cloth. The fire burned low. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the silence was warm. And though sleep did not come easily, it came with a quiet knowing. You were being led somewhere older than roads. By the 14th day, the cave had turned into a cocoon of breath and warmth, its stone belly dimly lit by the fading coals of the night's fire. Outside, the storm still murmured in gusts of thick snow and drifting ice. The world had not lifted its veil. The mouth of the cave remained half filled with white, like a throat slowly swallowing silence. You woke slowly, your body stiff, your fingers numb despite the furs. The amulet rested on your chest, pressed between skin and cloth, as warm as your own breath. You rose quietly, not to disturb the stillness, and stepped toward the cave entrance. The snow had eased sometime in the night, but it had left its mark. A smooth blanket covered the ground beyond, unbroken, untouched. The trees you had passed days ago were no longer visible. Even the hills had lost their shape. The land was a single curve of white, like an ocean frozen mid-wave. Behind you, the mother stirred. She moved to the fire without speaking, her fingers already unwrapping dried herbs to grind into the morning brew. The father sat beside the horses, gently brushing the frost from their manes. The animals breathed heavily, but remained calm. They knew, as the family did, that the storm had passed, but not completely. It would be a day of waiting. The eldest son spent the morning preparing arrows, realigning fletching, testing shafts for balance. He placed each one beside the next in precise rows on a cloth square. Each was identical at first glance, but you saw now that every arrow had been touched with slight differences. A color here, a carving there, the angle of the notch subtly changed. You watched and he let you. When you reached to help him hold a shaft steady, he nodded once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. Later, the mother retrieved the stones once more. This time, she laid them in a different pattern, 3 in a triangle, 1 in the center, the others held aside. She placed the one you had chosen, the eye, at the triangle's center. Then, slowly, she lit a small stick of resin and let the smoke curl around the arrangement. She did not chant, nor did she speak. She simply sat, watching the smoke, her breath even and deep. The child approached and sat beside her. He closed his eyes and mirrored her posture. So you did the same. There was something in the act that made the cave feel larger. Not physically, but in time. As if you had stepped out of the day and into a space beneath it. A space where the snow could not touch and where memories curled like smoke, drawn toward meanings not written or spoken, but felt. When the smoke burned out, the mother packed the stones away. No one discussed what had occurred. Instead, the family returned to simple tasks. The father carved narrow strips of leather, threading them through bone rings for a new halter. The son practiced drawing and loosing his bow without an arrow, repeating the motion until it seemed part of his breath. The child slept, his arms wrapped around a bundle of spare cloth like a small animal. You sat by the fire and stared into its heart. Its light danced across the cave walls, revealing faint lines and scratches that might have been marks or might have been time's doing. The amulet throbbed faintly with your pulse. You held it for a moment and turned it in your hand. The spiral on its face seemed more complex now, less a symbol, more a map. When night fell again, the cave was warmer, and the wind outside had slowed to a whisper. The sky beyond was clearing, one star at a time breaking through the veil. That evening, the father spoke again. He told of a road made not by feet, but by fire, a place where lightning struck the same plane twice each year, burning a line through the grass that pointed toward the sacred mountain. Few followed it, fewer returned, but those who did came back with their voices changed, not louder, quieter, like they carried something that must be whispered. The eldest son listened with narrowed eyes. The mother stirred the fire softly, a rhythm in her wrist that matched the father's words. The child asked no questions. He only watched the flames, wide-eyed and silent. You did not know if the road was real. But in this land, truth and myth were often the same. Later, long after the fire had faded to embers, you stepped to the edge of the cave one last time. The snow had hardened under the stars, its surface shining like glass. The wind no longer whispered, it had stilled. You looked out and saw the faintest hint of a path carved into the snow, not by feet, but by presence. Not straight, not clear, but unmistakably forward. Behind you, the family rested, and you stood, for a long while, on the threshold between stone and sky, between story and silence, between what you were and what you might be if you followed the wind. The 15th day began with quiet resolve. At dawn, the family broke camp with practiced calm. The snow outside the cave had hardened into a brittle crust that cracked beneath your boots as you stepped onto it. The world had sharpened overnight, edges clearer, shadows darker, the breath of the horses rising in tall silver columns. No one spoke. The morning was not one for words. The father led them out, his horse stepping slowly onto the ice-bound slope beyond the ridge. The others followed in single file, their shapes narrow and sure against the white. You followed, your hands gripping the reins more confidently now, your seat in the saddle no longer a stranger's perch, but a place you understood in the spine and hips. The descent was slow. The sun, pale and distant, cast a thin light through the peaks, illuminating nothing more than what was necessary. The valley below seemed carved not by time, but by breath, wide, slow, and ancient. Patches of black earth had begun to emerge where the snow had thinned. Grass tips, stiff and brown, poked through like whispers of a world that had once known warmth. By mid-morning, you came upon tracks, not of deer or fox or bird. These were heavier, wider, pressed deeply into the snow in lines that curved and doubled back. Wagon wheels, hooves in tight formation, not fresh but not yet washed away. The father dismounted and examined them, pressing his palm against one of the imprints. He muttered something, then looked toward the mountains, his face unreadable. The eldest son joined him, and together they traced the prints westward with their eyes. Then the decision was made. The caravan would veer east, further into the wilderness. You rode longer that day than usual. The terrain changed once more. Hills dotted with low shrubs, patches of wild thistle, and broken trees split by wind or lightning. The horses moved cautiously, but the pace never slackened. In the late afternoon, you crossed a ridge where cairns stood shoulder to shoulder, nearly 20 of them, each built with care. Some bore animal skulls, others lengths of carved bone or tightly wound cloth faded to gray. They were not graves. They were warnings. The mother dismounted here and walked between them in silence. She did not touch anything, but she stopped at one, taller than the rest, marked by a red slash across its face. She bowed her head, then turned back to the group and gestured to move quickly. You did not ask. You had learned not to. As evening fell, the landscape shifted again. The air thinned. A wide basin opened before you, ringed by cliffs and narrow ridges. There, nestled between two arms of stone, stood a single wooden structure. A watch post, perhaps, or a shrine. Its roof had partially caved in, and the walls leaned to one side, but the frame held. Smoke no longer rose from it, and no sound came from within. Still, the father approached. He tied his horse to a nearby tree and motioned for the eldest son to stay back. Alone, he entered the shrine. You waited in the growing dark, eyes fixed on the doorway. Minutes passed, then more. When he returned, his face was drawn but calm. He held something in his hand, a strip of cloth patterned with faded ink. He gave it to the mother. She looked at it, pressed it to her chest, and nodded. Nothing more was said. That night, they made camp near the ruin. No fire was lit. The air was too still, and the father's eyes scanned the ridge until the stars emerged. The amulet around your neck felt heavier than before, its spiral seemed to deepen under your touch. As you lay beneath the firs, the child curled beside his mother and whispered something. A question, perhaps. She didn't answer. She just held him closer. And you, listening to the breath of the world beyond the ruined shrine, knew something was shifting. You were further from the world you had known than ever before, but closer somehow to something truer, something old enough that even the wind bowed in its presence. The 16th morning rose without color. The sky held the pale tone of burnished steel, and the light it offered had no warmth. The wooden shrine, half leaning and silent, looked almost as if it had grown from the rocks around it, its beams silvered with time and silence. The family broke camp with careful gestures, each movement precise. The absence of fire from the night before had left them cold, but not weakened. The cold was now a companion, not an enemy. The father walked a short circle around the shrine before leaving. He did not look back. The mother, as she tied the last of the bundles to her horse, slipped the cloth strip, marked with its faded symbols, into a pocket sewn deep into her coat. She pressed her hand against it once, lightly, then mounted. They headed northeast. The land climbed again, but not into mountain. These were plateaus, wind-scarred and flat, with shallow rises like frozen waves. Small rock formations jutted from the snow, as if the earth itself had once been molten and cooled mid-movement. Sparse vegetation returned here. Tough shrubs with tiny leaves, patches of lichen, moss clinging to stone. The wind had changed. No longer fierce, it moved with low intent, curling along the ridges like a whisper. It carried scents now, faint traces of smoke, of iron, and something sour. The father paused more often, scanning the land, sometimes dismounting to press his hand to the soil or inspect a half-buried shard of something. His words were few, but his eyes were alive with reading. You saw fewer birds. The eldest son rode further ahead than before, disappearing for long minutes at a time. When he returned, his face bore the stillness you had come to recognize. Not peace, but focus, the kind that knew things could shift without warning. By midday, the caravan reached a wide stone basin. There were signs of fire here, old fire. Rings of blackened earth, long cold ashes, bits of burned cloth and bone, not scattered like a raid, but gathered, controlled, ritual. The father circled one of the pits and placed a stone in its center. The mother dismounted and whispered into her cupped hands. The wind caught her breath and carried it away. You did not stop for long. The next stretch was harder. The snow thinned, replaced by uneven ground, brittle with frost. The horses stumbled more often, and the sky remained flat and gray, offering no hint of time's passage. When you finally stopped to rest, it was at a cliff's edge overlooking a narrow valley. A path wound down, barely visible through the jagged rocks and pockets of snow. There, in the valley's heart, was movement. Not people, not fire, just suggestion. A structure, perhaps, hidden partially by the terrain. Dark against the snow, still. The father watched it for a long time. The eldest son stood beside him, arrow nocked but not drawn. Then they descended. The path was steep and winding, hemmed in by cliff on one side and drop on the other. The horses moved slowly, their muscles tense beneath the saddle. You felt each step like a drumbeat in your chest. As you neared the valley floor, the structure revealed itself. An old stone compound, half collapsed, with only 3 walls remaining and no roof. The stones were massive, black with age, fitted so tightly they seemed grown rather than built. Markings lined the lintels, slashes, spirals, and the faded relief of a face so worn it had become expressionless. The family did not enter. They circled the structure once, keeping distance. The mother tied a strip of white cloth to a low thorn bush nearby. The child stayed close to her, watching everything with wide, unblinking eyes. You dismounted and stepped forward alone. Something about the place called to you, not with words, but with gravity. You approached the entrance, hands loose, breath slow. Inside, there was no echo. The space absorbed sound. The walls held no script you could read, but you felt presence, not threat, not welcome, just presence. Like entering a room someone had just left or had always been in. You stood still, the amulet warm against your chest. Then you turned and left. When night came, the camp was made far from the stone ruin. No one spoke of it, but its shape lingered in the mind like a shadow after bright light. The fire burned low, and the stars returned above, faint behind a veil of thin cloud. The eldest son took first watch. His silhouette stood firm against the edge of camp, bow across his knees. The father sat near the fire, rubbing a stone between his palms. The mother unwrapped a cloth bundle and retrieved a single carved horn. She turned it over in her hands, but did not lift it to her lips. The child slept early, curled into the furs without protest. And you, staring into the fire's slow dance, thought again of the spiral on your amulet, how it seemed not to lead inward, but to carry you out. A path, winding and widening, into something neither known nor feared, only accepted. On the 17th day, the sky changed. The wind blew from the south now, softer, warmer, and tinged with the scent of damp stone and thawed earth. As you stirred beneath the furs, you noticed the stillness of the horses, the hush in the air, and the way the clouds moved with slow deliberation, like the breathing of a giant long buried beneath the hills. You rose to find the father already gone from camp. His footprints, half filled with frost, led toward the cliffside above the ruined stone compound. The eldest son stood nearby, watching that same ridge in silence, his arms crossed over his chest. When the father returned, his coat was dusted with snow, his expression distant. He spoke briefly with the mother, words low, careful. She responded with a nod, then began repacking the firestones without waiting for instruction. The child, sleepy-eyed, helped fold the blankets. They would not linger here. The valley was left behind by noon, the caravan cutting through a narrow gorge that twisted like a scar between two ancient ridges. The walls of rock bore strange shapes, natural at first glance, but the longer you looked, the more deliberate they felt. Lines, curves, hollows, echoes of symbols long eroded. The horses moved with steady nerves, but their ears twitched often, their steps lighter. In that gorge, the wind disappeared. Sound vanished. Even the crunch of hooves against frost-bitten ground was dampened, as though the air had thickened around you. You did not speak. The silence became its own presence, like traveling through the space between two dreams. When the path finally opened again, the world seemed larger than before. Hills rolled outward in every direction, studded with low bushes and streaked with veins of ice. In the far distance, shapes moved, no more than specks, shifting slowly along the horizon, herds perhaps, or people. The eldest son squinted toward them but said nothing. By late afternoon, the caravan reached a frozen stream. It wound like glass through the lowlands, its edges rimmed with pale green moss. The water moved beneath the surface, barely but surely. The mother led her horse to the edge and knelt, breaking the crust with a stick and scooping water with her hands. The father followed, then gestured for the rest to do the same. You knelt beside them, cupped the icy water and drank. It tasted of stone and deep time. That evening they made camp near a grove of crooked birches, their white bark peeling in long ribbons. The fire was built against a tall boulder to shield it from wind, and the family worked quickly, as if expecting something. The mother prepared a thicker stew, mixing crushed roots and dried meat with snow melt. Its scent was earthy and strong, filling the air like incense. The child sat close to her side, eyes half closed, humming a quiet melody that no one corrected. The father unwrapped a bundle you had not seen before. Inside was a small drum, round and worn, its skin darkened by years of use. Around its edge were markings, some faded, some vivid, stars, spirals, and figures of animals running in a ring. He held it gently like something alive and tapped it once with a narrow stick. The sound was not loud. It did not echo. It simply settled into the space between breaths. Then he began to play. The rhythm was slow, steady, like footsteps in soft earth. It did not rise or fall. It circled like the amulet's spiral, drawing you inward, not into trance, but into stillness. The mother added her voice to the sound, not a song, but a low chant. The words were old and the cadence slow. The eldest son watched the fire, lips barely moving, joining her in breath more than voice. Even the child, so often restless, sat unmoving, his fingers tracing lines into the dirt at his side. You did not know the words, but you felt them. The rhythm built not in volume, but in depth. It became something felt in the chest, behind the eyes, in the soles of your feet. The drum and the chant folded into one another until you could not tell which led and which followed. Then, as simply as it began, it ceased. Silence returned, not heavy, but whole. The fire crackled softly. The horses rustled beyond the grove. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once. No one spoke. And in that moment you understood. Not all songs were meant to be heard. Some were meant to be carried. On the 18th day, the snow began to melt. Not in torrents or rivulets, but in slow weeps that dampened the soil and darkened the stones. Drops fell from the birch branches like a quiet chorus, tapping against the leather of your coat, softening the world's edges. The cold remained, but it had lost its grip. Spring, though distant, had exhaled. The family woke early, as always. But their movements were different, less guarded, almost lighter. The father spoke briefly to the mother, then to the eldest son, and gestures passed between them like birds in mid-flight. You did not hear every word, but the direction was clear. Today they would move toward the plain. The horses stepped with more certainty across the thawing ground. Their hooves sank deeper now, the frost beneath them no longer solid. The wind returned from the east, dry and high, carrying scents of distant grass, of thawed roots, and old ash. It sang low in the reeds that clung to the stream banks, a voice ancient and unreadable. By midday, the caravan had reached an open field where the snow had almost fully receded. Here, the earth showed its scars, long lines where wagon wheels had once passed, patches of burned grass, the remains of an old fire ring now filled with moss. The father dismounted and examined the ground, brushing aside leaves to reveal a rusted horseshoe half buried in dirt. He held it up, turned it once in the light, and then buried it again. You continued on, following the faint track of that old passage, its memory barely clinging to the land. The eldest son moved ahead, stopping only once to trace something on a standing stone, marks so faded they could barely be seen. He copied the shape with his finger, then wiped it away with his palm, as if carrying it with him instead. In the distance, small herds moved across the plain, deer or perhaps wild sheep. They stayed far from the path, pausing only briefly to raise their heads and watch you. Their stillness was not fear, it was understanding. That evening, you camped in a shallow bowl of land, shielded by rising earth on three sides. A grove of wind-stunted pines offered shelter, their trunks twisted like old rope. The mother built a strong fire here, feeding it with branches thick with resin that crackled and popped with every flare. The scent of pine filled the camp, mingling with the scent of leather, smoke, and meat roasting low over the coals. The child, more playful than usual, danced a short circle around the flames, kicking up dirt and laughing. The eldest son joined him, not in play, but in rhythm, his feet moving in practiced steps, the memory of some old pattern emerging through motion. The father clapped once in time with them, just once, then let the silence fill the space again. As the night deepened, the mother brought out a small wooden box and opened it carefully. Inside were dyed threads and a narrow piece of leather shaped like a band. She began to stitch as she spoke, not a tale this time, but a memory. She spoke of her mother's hands, how they smelled of horsehair and wood smoke, of a time when her people gathered in circles twice this size and shared one fire, one pot, one song, how the smoke rose then in pillars so high it touched the stars. The child asked why they didn't gather now. She didn't answer, but her stitching did not pause. Later she handed the band to you. It was simple, dark leather edged in red thread. At its center, stitched in black, was the shape of an open eye, nearly the same as the mark on your stone. She gestured to your wrist. You tied it on. The fire crackled low. The stars peeked through the canopy of pine. The wind had stilled. You slept that night with the leather band pressed against your skin and the amulet resting warm above your heart. No dreams came, only a sense of being woven, not into a family, but into a path. The 19th day dawned beneath a pale, wavering sky. Thin clouds moved above like ghosts without direction, and the wind stirred faintly through the low trees, no longer sharp, but uncertain, torn between seasons. You rose slowly, feeling the damp weight of dew clinging to your cloak, your boots heavier with the moisture of the thawing ground. The fire had burned low overnight, reduced to faintly glowing coals that hissed when touched by drops from the pine above. The mother was already tending to the ashes, scraping them aside to reveal warmth for the morning's bread. She worked with calm, practiced patience, the way one might coax meaning from silence. The father stood at the edge of the grove, arms crossed, watching the sky. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in calculation. A choice lay ahead, one path curving through the valley where water pooled in slow streams, another climbing gently into hills still covered with frost. Neither looked easy, neither offered clarity. The eldest son joined him. Their conversation was brief, marked more by pauses than words. Eventually the father pointed north, and the decision was made. The journey resumed through wet ground, your horse's hooves pulling free with soft, reluctant sounds at every step. Birds moved overhead in low arcs, silent, close to the land. You passed through shallow dips where frogs stirred and reeds quivered. The smell of thaw and rot mingled, the scent of the earth returning to itself. Near midday, the group came upon a tree standing alone on a hill, a tall cedar, its roots half exposed, its branches of cloth ribbons in faded blues and reds. Some fluttered with the wind, others hung stiff, brittle with time. Beneath it were small offerings, stones, coins, and a pile of worn beads blackened with age. The mother dismounted first. She approached with a bowl of water and a pinch of ground herbs. She poured the mixture at the roots of the tree and whispered a few words, pressing her palm flat against the bark. The child mimicked her, though with smaller steps, smaller gestures. The father stood back, his hand resting on his horse's bridle, his eyes lowered. You approached last. You did not speak. You simply placed your hand where hers had been and left a small token behind, a fragment of dried root you had carried since the cave. It was not tradition. It was instinct. From there, the land rose steadily. The snow returned in thin patches, hiding in shaded pockets where the sun's warmth had not yet reached. The wind grew colder again, more focused, as if remembering its purpose. The father signaled a halt by late afternoon, pointing ahead toward a rocky outcrop shaped like a leaning wall. Behind it, shelter. Camp was set swiftly. The fire was built within a circle of stones, higher than usual, its light catching the edges of the rock and casting long shadows behind you. The eldest son carved thin strips of wood into kindling, while the child collected snow in a pot to melt for water. The mother unpacked a tightly sealed bundle wrapped in oilskin. Inside was dried cheese and dense salted meat, wrapped with dried cherries. A meal for strength. That night, the stars came clearer than they had in days. No clouds, no mist, just the dome of night, wide and absolute. The cold sharpened, but the fire pushed it back, and the family sat close, not for warmth, but for listening. The father spoke slowly, his voice barely above the crackle of flame. He told of a mountain once climbed not for conquest, but to carry a song. A lone rider tasked not with war, but with memory, sent to reach the summit before the old chant was lost to those below. The rider did not return, but the wind, they said, carried the song down the slopes, and those who heard it in their sleep remembered names they'd never been taught. The mother closed her eyes as he spoke. The eldest son stared into the fire. The child leaned against her, eyelids heavy. You listened, not with the ears, but with something deeper, something now shaped by the amulet against your chest, the leather band at your wrist, the silence that had become your teacher. As the fire burned low, the father reached into his coat and drew a pouch no larger than his palm. He handed it to you. Inside were 5 small stones, unmarked, smooth, cool. He said only one word, choose. You looked at the stones. They were identical in form, yet each felt different in your hand. One lighter, one heavier, one strangely warm, one jagged beneath the surface, and one that felt hollow. You picked the second. He nodded once, took the others, and returned them to the pouch. You did not ask what it meant, because meaning in this land did not arrive with explanation. It arrived with time. The 20th day arrived veiled in a sky of thin light and restless clouds. The wind had turned again, this time rising from the northeast, brushing the slopes with long, slow strokes, as if smoothing the land before some unseen event. When you woke, the fire was already a circle of white ash, and the family stood ready, not hurried, but solemn, as if this day were not like the others. The stone you had chosen the night before still sat in your pocket, cool against your leg. You could feel its presence, not as weight, but as awareness. It wasn't a token. It was a key, though the door it belonged to remained unseen. You rode in silence through rising hills that folded gently into one another like the bellows of a sleeping creature. The snow was sparse now, tucked only in shaded folds. The ground was brown and gray, dry in places, soft in others. The trees were fewer and their shapes stranger, twisted pines that leaned against one another, branches curled as if reaching for something just out of sight. By mid-morning, the eldest son dismounted and knelt by a stone outcrop. He pressed his ear to it, then tapped twice with his knuckles. The sound that returned was hollow. He stood, nodded once to the father, and the group moved on. You passed old markers along the ridge, cairns that had long lost their shape, cloth faded to the color of stone, and broken posts that once bore flags. The land here remembered everything, even what had been taken away. At midday you crested a hill and saw it, a circle of stones, vast and sunken, hidden in a shallow basin between hills. From above, it looked like an eye carved into the land, ringed with tall, weathered monoliths and strewn with scattered shapes in its center. More stones, some upright, some fallen, some nearly buried. The caravan halted. The father dismounted and walked ahead alone. He did not enter the circle, but approached its edge and knelt, placing both hands on the ground. The rest of the family followed, and you did too. No one stepped inside. The mother lit a small bundle of herbs, and the smoke rose in a single column, then drifted sideways into the wind. The child held a feather in both hands and kept his eyes on the sky. Then the eldest son turned to you. He pointed to the stone circle, then to your chest where the amulet hung, then to your pocket. The meaning was clear. You stood, breath steady, and descended the shallow slope alone. The stones loomed taller as you approached. Their surfaces were rough with age, carved with faint symbols, scratches, spirals, weather-worn grooves. No two alike. You moved between them, guided more by intuition than plan. At the center was a flat stone, half buried, its surface worn smooth by time and wind. You knelt before it and pulled the stone from your pocket. It looked smaller now, though your hand had not changed. You placed it gently on the flat surface. At first, nothing moved. No sound came. But the wind shifted. It fell still, as if the world had inhaled. Then a sound, not loud, not sharp, a deep, low vibration, felt more in your chest than in your ears. The stone beneath your palm warmed slightly, not a heat of fire, but of recognition. You closed your eyes. For a moment, there was only breath. Yours. The land's, the hush between heartbeats. Then you stood, left the stone where it lay, and turned back toward the ridge. The family remained where you'd left them. The father's eyes met yours first, then the mother's. Then the eldest son nodded once, slowly. Nothing was said. That night, camp was made on a high ledge above the basin. The fire was modest, its light casting long, angular shadows. The child fell asleep with the feather still in his hand. The mother sewed quietly beside the flames. The eldest son polished his blade with soft, circular strokes, and the father sat beside you. He did not ask what you had felt. He did not explain the stone. He only placed another item in your palm, a strip of leather dyed deep red, with the shape of a spiral tooled into its center. You tied it next to the other. The fire crackled, the wind returned, and the circle behind you remained still, as it had for generations, watching, waiting, never forgotten. The 21st day broke slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the hush that had settled over the basin during the night. Mist curled around the stones in the distance, winding through the gaps like breath escaping from a sleeping giant. The sunrise was a smear of pale color low on the horizon, barely enough to illuminate the frost that had gathered on the grass. You woke early, not from sound, but from a quiet pulse beneath your skin, a rhythm you now recognized, though you could not name it. The amulet at your chest rested warm, and the new leather strip dyed red and marked with the spiral had softened against your wrist, as if it had always been there. The family rose without need for words. The child stirred and rubbed his eyes, still clutching the feather from the night before. The mother gently uncurled his fingers and tied the feather into a cord at his belt. She didn't say why. She didn't need to. The fire was left to die. The ashes scattered. The path led westward now, across rolling ridges where the wind moved in strong, steady lines. It carried flecks of dried leaves, a scattering of dust, and the faint scent of dry sagebrush. The snow was gone from the earth entirely here, though streaks of it clung to the shadows of boulders and low hollows. You rode with your head tilted slightly against the wind, your horse calm beneath you, your hands sure on the reins. By midday, the terrain grew sharper, less gentle rise and fall, more sudden breaks, as if the land had split open and then been stitched loosely back together. Jagged stones jutted out from the soil at odd angles. The father slowed the caravan, eyes scanning the horizon. There was something watchful in his posture, something that made the air tighten, and then you saw it. A line of standing stones on the next ridge, not ancient like those of the basin, not sacred in their posture, but purposeful, square-edged, dark, freshly marked, border stones. The eldest son rode ahead. He stopped at the highest one and turned it slightly, exposing a shallow carving on its base. Not a symbol, a number, then another and a third. Coordinates. The father joined him. Together, they examined the stones in silence. The mother remained back with you and the child. Her hand rested on the hilt of a small knife tied beneath her cloak, not in fear, in readiness. When the men returned, the father pointed to the low hills that crept along the valley's western edge. The caravan would go around, quietly. You rode in tighter formation after that. There were no signs of others, no smoke, no hoof prints. But the presence lingered, like a scent that had not yet faded. The horses moved with greater care. Their ears twitched. Their eyes scanned the edges of shadow. You found yourself watching the sky, the rocks, the folds of land ahead, listening not for sound, but for stillness broken. By early evening, you reached a wooded slope thick with cedar and twisted pine. The trees here leaned eastward, shaped by a wind that never stopped. The air beneath the canopy was cool and dry, scented with sap and old needles. The father dismounted and signaled for camp to be made, but the fire that night was hidden. Stones were placed around it. A covering built of brush and bark allowed the smoke to bleed sideways, low and dark, barely rising above the camp. The mother cooked in silence, her movements faster than usual. The child stayed close to her side, eyes wide and quiet. The eldest son disappeared briefly into the trees and returned with 3 feathers, each one stripped clean of fluff, their shafts stained red. He handed one to each of you. You tucked yours into your coat without knowing why. Not decoration, not warning, a sign for the unseen. Later, when the child had fallen asleep and the fire was coals, the father spoke. He told of those who came through the valley from the east, not raiders, not riders, but seekers, men who spoke little and asked for nothing, who carried scrolls instead of swords and followed maps drawn by hands that had never seen the land. They called the valley empty. They called the stones unclaimed, but the land remembered them, and those who watched had not forgotten. The mother added only one word: return. It hung in the air like smoke, slow to rise, impossible to dismiss. That night you lay awake longer than usual. The amulet felt heavier, not dangerous, just alert, like an eye opened in a dream. You watched the trees sway in the wind and listened for a silence that meant more than quiet. The 22nd day came with wind and movement. It was the kind of wind that did not whisper or howl, but pressed. It came from the west this time, sweeping through the trees in low, measured bursts that bent branches and stirred needles loose from high limbs. The scent it carried was unfamiliar, like ironstone warmed by sun and the dry dust of places too often walked by men. The family broke camp before the sky had lightened. The fire, covered with stones the night before, was left cold and buried. The trees groaned softly around you, not in protest but in warning. The eldest son led the way. His bow remained unstrung, but his posture had shifted into something quieter. The kind of quiet one adopts not to avoid sound, but to blend into it. You rode with the mother and child. The father remained behind for a short while, then followed. His eyes scanned more often. His horse moved slower, not from weariness, but calculation. The path they followed now did not snake through ridges or weave through valleys. It moved downward, into open land, into grass where the snow had fully vanished, into the threshold between forest and steppe. By midday, they had reached the edge. The forest behind was tall and close. The land ahead was low and wide. Between them stood a stretch of shallow basin, where the grass lay flattened and the air felt strangely thin. You crossed it without speaking. Even the child was silent now. Then you saw them. Stakes in the earth. Thin poles, each no taller than your chest, arranged in uneven rows. Some leaned, others had fallen. Rags clung to a few. Faded cloth, once red or blue, now sun-bleached and frayed. At first it seemed random. Then the pattern became clear. This was not a marker. It was a boundary. The father dismounted and approached the nearest pole. He knelt beside it, placed his hand on the ground, and whispered something. The mother followed. Then the son. Then the child, who pressed his forehead against the wood and stayed there longer than the rest. You stood among them, feeling the low pulse of the wind against your skin, watching the cloth flutter gently. The father turned to you and pointed ahead. Beyond the stakes, the steppe stretched endlessly, gold and silver in the afternoon light. In the far distance, smoke rose. Not a signal, not a fire, a camp. You moved again, this time walking. The horses were led in silence. No one spoke. No one looked back. As the sun began to lower, they stopped. A wide stone lay half buried at the top of a low hill. Upon it were carved 4 concentric circles, each ring broken in one place to form a path between them. It had been worn down by time, but the markings remained deep enough to read. The mother reached into her coat and pulled out the cloth strip from the old shrine, still folded, still marked with ink faded to brown. She placed it gently at the center of the circle and stepped back. The father removed his gloves and took your hand. He led you to the stone. His eyes were steady. He gestured to your amulet, and you placed it in his palm. Then, with slow care, he laid it at the outer ring of the carving. His fingers pressed it into the groove, and when he pulled away, the spiral gleamed slightly in the low sun. Then he stepped back and waited. So did the others. You did not know what to do, but your body did. You knelt before the stone, placed your hand beside the amulet, and closed your eyes. The wind grew still. The silence deepened. And within that silence came something else. Not sound, not memory, but a sensation. Like the steppe exhaling. Like the ring of stone below your fingers was no longer still, but turning, slow, like the sun across the sky, like the seasons, like names passed through generations. You opened your eyes. The amulet had turned in its groove, once. The father stepped forward and took it back. He handed it to you without a word. The mother tied a second strip of red cloth to your wrist. The child looked at you with wide eyes and smiled, not for joy, but for knowing. That night they camped in the open, under stars that had returned with sudden clarity. The fire was small, the voices softer. The land listened, and the road ahead now waited, not in uncertainty, but in invitation. The 23rd day began beneath a cloudless sky. A rare expanse of blue stretched taut above the steppe like a forgotten banner. The air was thin and sharp, but the wind had calmed, leaving only the soft hush of hooves and the creak of saddle leather as the caravan moved forward. The land was different here, open, endless, yet no longer empty. Tracks marked the soil, recent ones. Hooves, boots, wagon wheels. Some deep, some shallow. Not just travelers, not just herds. A gathering had passed this way. The family moved with measured pace, not in fear, but in awareness. The father's gaze swept the plains like a hawk's. The eldest son rode farther ahead than usual, disappearing into dips in the earth, cresting rises with quiet grace. When he returned, he spoke briefly with the father. Their exchange carried in a glance more than sound. By midday, you reached a rise that overlooked a low valley, and there it was, the camp. Not a settlement, not a city, but vast. Dozens of gurs spread across the slope, their white felt glowing softly in the sunlight. Smoke rose from their central holes, curling into the still air. Horses grazed in wide, orderly circles, their reins tied to posts adorned with small carvings and dangling beads. Banners moved gently in the wind, some blue, some red, some marked with symbols that stirred recognition deep in your chest, though you could not read them. The family stopped. The mother adjusted her cloak, brushing dust from its hem. The child sat straighter in his saddle. The father dismounted, his expression composed, and reached into his coat to retrieve something wrapped in gray silk. The amulet. He held it for a long moment, then tied it once more around your neck. The red cord on your wrist had deepened in color with dust and time. The stone you had placed in the circle, now nestled back into your pocket, felt warm. You were not a guest now, not a visitor. You were becoming part of what lay ahead. The descent into the valley was slow and deliberate. No one met you at first, but eyes watched, faces half hidden in doorways, children perched atop fence rails, old women stirring pots outside their tents. A soft murmuring passed among them as you neared. At the center of the camp stood the largest jur, its roof adorned with colored cloth, small bells, and feathers that shifted gently with each movement of air. Beside it, a tall wooden frame held a banner marked with a spiral, the same shape as your amulet, the same carved lines you had traced on stone, in earth, in memory. The father stopped at the frame. He did not knock. He waited. Then the flap was lifted. A man emerged, tall, wrapped in layers of heavy wool, with hair bound in a long braid tipped in silver thread. His face bore age not in weakness, but in weight. He looked first at the father, then at the eldest son, then at the amulet resting on your chest. He stepped forward and held out his hand, not to take it, but to greet you. You placed your palm against his. It was not ceremony. It was recognition. He stepped aside and motioned for the group to enter. Inside the great jar, the air was warm, heavy with the scent of herbs, wood smoke, and the faint sharpness of dried pine resin. The space was circular, the walls adorned with old cloth, beads, and talismans, each different, each telling a story without need for voice. A low fire glowed at the center, above it a kettle suspended from a carved frame. Others sat within, men and women, young and old, dressed in long coats and fur-lined boots. Some watched you with curiosity, others with calm. You were offered a place near the fire. The father spoke first. His words were slow, respectful. He He spoke of the journey, of the lands crossed, of the stone circle and the cairns, of the winds turning, and the amulet's answer. He did not exaggerate. He did not hide. When he finished, silence followed. Then the man who had greeted you spoke. His voice was low but clear, carved from the same timber as the mountains, shaped by the same breath as the steppe. He asked you to rise. You did. He approached, studied you, and asked a question. You could not understand the words, but the shape of them, the sound, the tilt of his head, the gesture to your chest, told you what he meant. Are you ready? You did not speak. You placed your hand over the amulet and bowed your head. He turned back to the circle and nodded. That night you were given your own place to sleep inside the great jur. The fire burned low and voices murmured deep into the night. The child curled beside the mother. The eldest son sat at the door, his silhouette framed by starlight. The father slept with his back to the flame, the rhythm of his breath steady and deep. You closed your eyes beneath the curve of the roof, beneath the old symbols and gently swaying feathers, and you did not dream. You listened. The 24th day began before dawn, when the stars still held their vigil over the wide sky, and the fire in the center of the great jar glowed soft and red. The silence was not of sleep, but of anticipation, a kind that fills the air before snow falls, before hooves strike ground, before the first word of a story is spoken. You awoke not from sound, but from stillness, the sense that the moment around you had gathered into something more than itself. The air inside the jar was warm and perfumed faintly with herbs that clung to the tapestries and cushions. The others were already awake, seated in the circle around the fire, their faces calm, their eyes turned inward. You joined without being called. The elder who had greeted you the day before, his name still unknown to you, yet deeply familiar, rose and motioned for the flap of the jar to be opened. Cold morning air spilled into the space, filled with the scent of frost and smoke from 100 small fires across the valley. He gestured for you to follow. Outside, the camp stirred slowly. People moved between tents in quiet procession, not hurried, not distracted. They were preparing, though no horn had sounded, no banner had been raised. It was not war they readied for. It was remembering. You were led to the circle of standing stones at the edge of the camp, smaller than the one in the basin, but arranged in the same shape, carved with the same spirals and paths. Around it stood others, figures wrapped in fur and wool, some wearing feathers, some with beads or bone charms woven into their braids. Their eyes met yours not as strangers, but as witnesses. The elder approached the center of the stone circle and laid a piece of leather in the dust. Upon it was a spiral carved in black. Then he stepped back. The father handed you something wrapped in cloth. You unwrapped it slowly and found inside the small stone you had chosen days ago, the one that had rested in your palm and later turned in the center of the great circle. It had changed. The surface was now etched with a second marking, subtle and fine, a curve that mirrored the spiral, but ran beneath it like a shadow or echo. It was not added by hand. It had emerged. You stepped forward and placed it on the leather square. The elder raised his hands and spoke, not loud, but clear. The words were foreign to you, yet each sound seemed carved from earth and wind. It was a naming, not of who you were, but of where you now belonged. One by one, members of the gathered circle added to the cloth, a strip of dyed thread, a bone bead, a feather, a sliver of stone. Not gifts, not offerings, reminders. When the last one was placed, the cloth was tied shut and handed back to you. The stone inside it was still warm. The amulet at your chest grew quiet, its weight settling. The red cords on your wrist, frayed now from wear, felt like roots wrapped around memory. You were led back to the jar, but not alone. The child walked beside you, his hand in yours. The mother followed, her eyes soft. The eldest son returned to his place at the door, bow resting across his lap. The father took his seat by the fire, and the elder joined him. There, in the glow of morning light filtering through the roof, tea was poured. Bread was passed. Laughter, low and sparse, moved through the space like the first thawed stream of spring. No ceremony was declared. No words of completion spoken. The journey had not ended. It had only folded into something deeper. You had come from a world where time moved forward like an arrow. Here time circled like wind on the open steppe, passing again through memory, through silence, through the shared breath of ancestors and fire. And in that circle, you now walked. The story of why you would not last a day in the Mongol Empire had long since unraveled, not because you learned to conquer it, but because you learned to listen. And in listening, you had become part of the land's breath, its silence, its rhythm. You sat beside the fire, the stone bundle in your lap, your hands still. And for the first time, you were no longer a guest. You were home.